Good morning. I want to thank everyone for being here today at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on international human trafficking and forced labor. In particular, I want to thank the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for coordinating this hearing and our witnesses for their leadership in combating modern-day slavery. I welcome our distinguished panelists, including from the administration and representatives from the non-governmental human rights and humanitarian communities. I look forward to hearing from them about the diplomatic and humanitarian measures needed to address this crisis. That in the 21st century, more than 20 million people worldwide find themselves living in conditions of modern-day slavery is an affront to humanity and our basic liberties, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. According to the International Labor Organization's 2012 findings, 22% are victims of forced sexual exploitation, with 68% victims of forced labor. These men, women, and children are unconscionably subjugated to conditions of slavery for the sake of a profit. According to a new ILO report, trafficking generates $150 billion in illegal profits each year. Of this, 2/3 is generated from sexual exploitation, with approximately $51 billion generated as a result of forced labor. Trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation has historically been the most commonly reported and prosecuted form of human trafficking globally. However, in our globalized economy with increasing demands for cheap migrant labor worldwide, labor trafficking has become an insidious growth industry as it is inadequately regulated and it preys on the vulnerable. Victims of forced labor and debt bondage are held in conditions of slavery in a variety of jobs, including agricultural and construction work, domestic servitude, and other labor-intensive jobs. Vulnerable men, women, and children trying to provide for their families are often the targets of exploitation and trafficking as a means to minimize overhead costs and provide cheaper goods at market. The spreading of forced labor has therefore led to an increase in its effects on the production, handling, and distribution of various goods. By now, we've all heard stories of shoppers finding desperate cries for help in the forms of notes stuffed into bags or stitched into clothing tags exported from factories worldwide to shops in our local neighborhoods. More recently, we've heard about harsh conditions endured by migrants and refugees forcibly employed in the fishing trade in Thailand. If we are to root out this horrific scourge on humanity, we must have a multifaceted approach to combat the root problems of the crisis and to hold accountable governments of countries that are sources, destinations, or transit centers for the innocent victims of trafficking and forced labor. I want to express my appreciation to Secretary of State John Kerry and Ambassador Luis Sidi-Baca and the staff of his office for their conviction and commitment to addressing these human rights violations and paving the road from victim to survivor, as expressed in the newly released 2014 Trafficking in Persons report. Though we have truly made progress, I expect Ambassador Sidi-Baca will be the first to agree that there is still much more to do before we can live in a world rid of slavery and exploitation. Congress must ensure that we work harder to eradicate this egregious human rights violation. To that end, on June 11th, Representatives Maloney and Smith introduced H.R. 4842, the Business Supply Chain Transparency on Trafficking and Slavery Act of 2014. This legislation seeks to require certain companies to disclose information describing any measures the company has taken to identify and address conditions of forced labor, slavery, human trafficking, and the worst forms of child labor within the company's supply chains. However, as this is a global problem, so too the solution must be global. The U.S. government must play a role in supporting global initiatives, such as the ILO Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention, 1930 and ILO Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers. Today's hearing will examine current trends in human trafficking and forced labor across the globe. I hope, in addition to outlining shortcomings in the battle on human trafficking, it will also highlight key successes and initiatives. It's now time to hear from our first witness, Ambassador Luis C. D. Baca directs the State Department's Office of Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which advocates for an end to modern slavery. And then we will have a second panel with many very qualified witnesses. And I also want to submit into the record any oral testimony along with the written testimony already provided by the witnesses. Ambassador?
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Representative and members of the Commission entirely. Tom Lantos was a leading light in getting the Trafficking Victims Protection Bill passed and was such an example to so many of us, whether we worked on his committee or were staff on sister committees. And for me, being able to appear before the Commission is personally very gratifying because of what he meant to me when I was working at Judiciary. But I want to talk first about somebody else who means a lot to us in the trafficking office, and that is Frederick Douglass, one of the first African-American ambassadors that the United States ever had, but more importantly, a person who escaped slavery and worked so hard to eradicate it, not just for his own community, the African-American community, but around the United States and around the world. He said one time that I prayed for my freedom for 20 years and never got an answer until I prayed with my feet. And that notion of the journey to freedom being something that is not ours to give to the victims, but rather a journey to walk with them on, and really think of them as survivors, people who can pray with their feet and can get out. And so one of the things that I want to just highlight in my testimony today is that notion of the survivors as being full participants in this fight. This isn't something we're doing for them or something we're doing to them, but rather we're doing with them. As you mentioned, Secretary Kerry released the annual Trafficking in Persons about a month ago, and it looks at the ongoing challenges of fighting human trafficking in about 190 countries and territories around the world. We've come a long way in our shared fight, and we saw, and we're very happy with the fact that about 45,000 victims were identified by governments in the last year, but up against the International Labor Association organization's most recent estimate, a conservative one, suggesting that there are over 21 million trafficking victims in the world, people held in servitude even as we speak. Clearly, we have a lot more work to do. First, the diagnostics. As you know, trafficking in persons covers all the activities involving holding a person in a condition of compelled service. Despite the name, it doesn't require moving a victim. Indeed, many people in forced labor around the world work in or near their home communities. But it does require the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel or maintain someone in labor or sexual exploitation, unless, of course, they're under 18 for commercial sex. Each year, we look at government efforts around the world through this 3P paradigm of prevention, protection, and prosecution. I grew up on a farm, so of course I have to make a agricultural reference. It's the 3 legs of the milking stool. You fall over if you only have 2 legs or even 1. Prevention, protection, and prosecution all together. And the TIP report ranks these countries. Last year, 31 governments in Tier 1, which is not getting an A on the test. This is basically the equivalent of a C, meeting the minimum standards. The United States is one of those, and we're doing some interesting things. We've got 55 of the 57 states and territories have passed modern anti-trafficking legislation, and every year we see more and more good policies, good trainings, more and more good outcomes for trafficking victims, and yet all I can say about the United States is that we are meeting the minimum standards. I'd like to say that the United States and the other 31 countries on Tier 1 are doing well, and we're going to keep working to make sure that we can get to that point. But right now we're talking about doing the bare minimum. 89 governments in Tier 2, 44 on the Tier 2 watch list, and then 23 governments on the lowest level, which is Tier 3. A couple of progress stars this year that I'd like to point out, Chile and Switzerland, both moved up into Tier 1 of the report, in part thanks to President Obama's meeting with former President Piñera in March of 2011 and the ongoing commitment of President Bachelet since she's come back. Chilean authorities have strengthened anti-trafficking law enforcement efforts through building police and prosecutor capacity. They obtained their first convictions for labor trafficking, increased interagency coordination, and created a national action plan and victim assistance protocol, all of the things that we've seen as a recipe for success around the world. In Switzerland, the government passed a law prohibiting the prostitution of minors for the first time, convicted more traffickers, issued more serious prison sentences, and launched the first ever nationwide awareness campaign. It's taken a lot of time and dedication, both from the United States and Switzerland, to get to that point, including the personal commitment of our ambassadors, Don Beyer and Susie Levine, which is much appreciated. We've seen a number of other countries where we've had progress, and it's put forward in my written testimony, but I do want to call out one here in the hemisphere, and that is Haiti. Amazingly, in a country where a slave revolt led to the creation of a new nation, Haiti had never made slavery a criminal offense and paid for it, with almost 300,000 children in domestic servitude in the practice known as Restavek, but what really is a form of modern slavery. 210 years after slaves seized their own freedom, the passage of the modern anti-trafficking legislation this spring made modern slavery illegal in Haiti and is very welcomed. We also this year in the report saw the operation of the auto downgrade provision of the 2008 law, which basically said that countries can only be on Tier 2 watch list for X number of years before they automatically have to fall down to Tier 3. If they're just stagnant, they're actually moving backwards. It might be the jet lag talking from the trip that I was on last week, but it's like being on one of the moving walkways at the airport. If you're just standing there facing the wrong direction, you're moving backwards. So the auto downgrade provision really was looking at how do you incentivize governments to move. And we saw that with Afghanistan, Barbados, Chad, and the Maldives, countries that took action, made serious efforts, and did not get subjected to that automatic downgrade provision of the law. But two significant allies and important trade partners of the United States did not show significant improvement. Thailand and Malaysia were put on Tier 3 this year as a result of that auto downgrade provision and their lack of sufficient progress going forward. Over the coming years, things to look at, both in you and your oversight function and us and our diplomacy, will be the 4 countries that face the automatic downgrade next year: Angola, Belarus, Burundi, and the Comoros. While human trafficking may seem far away, in reality it's very much part of our daily lives. And not only does it happen here in the United States, in both urban and rural settings, over 350 calls to the national hotline from Oregon alone last year, but in a globalized world, goods and services tainted from forced labor can easily enter the closets, pantries, and garages of even the most dedicated modern abolitionists. We continued to see in the report this year widespread use of forced labor throughout the world in a wide range of industries. And while governments have typically had more success in identifying and responding to sex trafficking cases than labor trafficking, and we do not want anyone to back off of those efforts, more must be done to combat all forms of modern slavery. A couple of sectors that I want to point out. Forced labor in mining was noted in 46 of the narratives this year, but the actions did not match the exploitation. No prosecutions or convictions whatsoever in the mining sector. And we're talking not the Klondike Gold Rush here, we're talking about artisanal mining, people scraping tantalum and coltan and other things that come into our cell phones, come into our mobile technologies, all the way from the Eastern Congo and other places. Highlighting the interconnections between human trafficking forms, sex trafficking related to the mining industry is discussed in 15 of the narratives, 15 countries where we saw that happening. Now, there were some prosecutions in Senegal and Namibia, and one conviction in Senegal, but we have a long way to go to tell consumers that the mineral they use, whether it's the mica that makes the lipstick glittery or whether it's the coltan that makes your cell phone not burn your pocket, is somehow slavery-free. Forced labor in agriculture is also very prevalent, and it's discussed in 126 narratives. 67% of the countries covered in the report, we saw forced labor in agriculture, including the United States. The report describes forced labor in activities as diverse as cattle herding and cultivating, cocoa, tea, potatoes, bananas, palm oil, sugarcane, and coffee. I've had many of those things in the last week, and I can't tell you whether or not they came from a place that was exploitation-free, despite the fact of what I do for a living. Forced labor in the seafood sector is discussed in 51 narratives, with 4 prosecutions and 2 convictions recorded. And again, the demand for commercial sex act related to the fishery sector exists, and it's noted in 8 countries around the world. So what are we doing in the face of these facts? We're supporting programs to counter forced labor in supply chains, such as work being done by the Solidarity Center in Bangkok to address human trafficking and other labor issues in the migrant communities. We're funding projects with the ILO and the UN Office of Drugs and Crime that address the role of recruitment fees charged to employees in facilitating human trafficking. The final ILO Global Report will be based on field research in Vietnam, China, and Paraguay, and the UNODC Global Report will focus on the criminal justice response and its impact in UAE, Thailand, and Mexico. Congresswoman, you mentioned the ILO report, 150 billion reasons why we have to fight human trafficking, telling us that this is not just a moral issue, this is not just a security issue, this is also an economic issue. $150 billion industry around the world. The conclusion of the ILO report is undeniable, and I'll simply quote them. The continued existence of forced labor is bad for business, bad for development, and bad for its victims. It's a practice that has no place in modern society and should be eradicated as soon as possible. A couple of very quick things that we're doing to address trafficking in the supply chain. Most importantly, to ensure that our tax dollars don't support this crime. President Obama signed an executive order 2 years ago strengthening protections against human trafficking in federal contracts, and we're happy to say that the regulations carrying out that order are in their final stages. We've had good input from NGOs, from the business community, from the academy to really look at that. And one thing that I'm struck by is the shared commitment and the shared values of all of the different actors to ensure that we have a slavery-free supply chain. As the largest purchaser of goods in the global economy, this was an important step that both signals to U.S. corporations what is expected by the largest customer in the world, but also demonstrates an approach that other governments can take to strengthen protections in their own procurement. I'd like to take a few moments to discuss the victims of this crime as well. The thematic focus, as you mentioned, Congresswoman, is the journey from victim to survivor. The impact of human trafficking is horrifying. Those who escape modern slavery struggle to recover, heal, reclaim their lives. It's not an easy path, and true recovery is far from guaranteed, but it can happen, and governments can hasten that process. But the report also highlights the importance of empowering trafficking survivors to strengthen the anti-trafficking movement itself. And as Secretary Kerry explains, and we know this from the domestic violence work, we know this from sexual violence movement over the last 25 and 30 years, from their experiences, survivors know better than anyone else the types of protections and opportunities that would help ensure others don't go through the same thing. Someone who is invisible to police can then provide advice on what law enforcement should have looked for. What types of awareness campaigns might have helped him or her see that they were a victim of a crime? A survivor who cooperated in the conviction of their trafficker knows best what made her participation in that process less traumatic and more effective. Survivors are strong. They are perhaps our best hope and our most overlooked resource for ending modern slavery once and for all. This was brought home to me in a vivid way yesterday when we hosted our annual intern roundtable, which brought over 350 interns from across town to think about this journey. There we saw Survivor Caucus member Evelyn Chumbaugh and Special Assistant to the President, Amy Pope, sharing a podium. A decade ago, the newly liberated child slave, Evelyn, met for the first time the young prosecutor, Amy Pope, and that day made the hard choice to trust her, to put her story forward and to take that leap that somebody from the government would actually help her pursue justice. A decade later yesterday, we saw the two of them together again as colleagues, confronting modern slavery together, but as equals. And that's what we're fighting for when we talk about this journey to freedom. So finally, what is the way forward? The TIP report and the tier rankings are a means to an end, not an end to themselves. We must not lose sight of the true goal, which is stopping modern slavery and helping victims recover. Only with concrete programs to help them find their voice and reclaim their lives can we help them become survivors. Recent years have seen increased concern about the stewardship of natural resources, ethical treatment of animals, and ensuring that farmers receive fair prices for their work. As a result, certifications and labels exist to inform customers whether seafood is sustainably caught, livestock is pasture-fed, chickens are free-range, coffee beans are fair trade, diamonds are conflict-free. I could go on. And yet those seals of approval, while fostering increased transparency and driving consumers to reward companies that engage in good corporate citizenship, they all seem to assume that the hands that pull the net, that the hands that pick the crops are not enslaved. We know that that assumption is non-operative. We have a responsibility to the 20+ million people around the world to break that cycle of human trafficking that forms the base of so many products and goods, to drive out of supply chains the patterns of vulnerabilities to forced labor, and to address the socioeconomic foundations of poverty that ensnare so many into these exploitative situations. It'll continue to require leaders throughout society, community workers, activists, faith groups, organized labor, government officials, industry leaders, to encourage producers to monitor their supply chains and buy and sell goods and services free of forced labor. So we will continue to build our knowledge of forced labor in the supply chain. We'll continue to expand our collaboration with other governments, the corporate sector, and civil society. And we look forward to working with you in Congress to proclaim freedom and seek justice so that we can achieve our ultimate goal, a world without slavery.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was excellent testimony. We're fortunate to have you as the ambassador. I know when you talked about the three-pronged approach, prevention, protection, and prosecution, that you as a former prosecutor really understand the importance of enforcement. Mm-hmm. It isn't just having the policies in effect, it's the enforcement that goes with them as well that's so important. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the TIP, the Trafficking in Persons Report. It's my understanding that the U.S. just became included in the rankings in 2010. So can you talk a little bit about the how that happened? What are the advantages to having the United States as a listed country? And has this encouraged other countries to improve their own ratings and rankings? I know you talked about the slipping back and being downgraded, but has there been some indication that there have been more encouragement for other countries? Is the U.S. serving as a model to other countries to improve their records?
One of the things that in the decision to include the United States in the report that Secretary Clinton and I talked a lot about was this notion of, would people discount it automatically by saying, oh, of course you're going to give yourself a great ranking on your own report. And at the end of the day, we felt that the risks of that were far outweighed by the salutary effect of putting it on. It's done a couple of things, I think. First of all, the rigor of the minimum standards analysis that we do for all of the other countries of the world is something that has helped us in the United States. We do this through an interagency process where we're gathering all of this information. We reach out to the non-governmental organizations so that they can send in information. The information gathering part of putting the United States into the report has been, I think, a very good thing as we've been able to hear more about what's happening in the U.S. In many ways, it's kind of like a doctor who has everybody take their blood pressure when they come to the doctor's office, but has for years not had his own blood pressure taken. We were telling other countries that these minimum standards were the way to go. 11 minimum standards that range from, what kind of laws do you have, what kind of victim protection you have, et cetera. And not doing that own diagnostic test on ourselves, I think, was actually hampering us. So there's a reason far beyond simply it's fair to look at ourselves if we're going to look at everyone else. But that's also a reason. So the notion of being able to talk to other governments and say, look, we have critical language in our own narrative. When you're looking at your situation, you have to be willing to put critical analysis of your own trafficking circumstances out in public. And if you're not willing to do that, you're going to be hampered. You're going to always have one hand tied behind your back. And so we've seen now, in Europe especially, the creation of monitoring mechanisms, whether it's a totally independent rapporteur like they have in the Netherlands, whether it's a entity like in Belgium with the National Human Rights Foundation, which is a de facto rapporteur, or whether it's somebody who is kind of a trafficking coordinator who has to put out a report. The Tier 1 countries especially, we're seeing that notion of self-critical reporting being one of the things that differentiates a Tier 2 country from a Tier 1 country. So I do think that it's had a good effect here in the United States.
Terrific, thank you. And I also want to ask you, we've heard a lot about the unaccompanied minors appearing at the border. It frequently discuss that here in the Capitol. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the situation in their home countries and the extent to which the situations in those countries might be causing a push factor. Might some of them be fleeing the types of situations we're hearing about today?
Well, one of the things that we've seen in Central America is this notion of the human trafficking problem being a very multifaceted one. In El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, you've got countries that have emerged over the last 20 years from civil strife, whether it's the dictatorship in Honduras, whether it's the civil war, certainly in the generation-long civil war in Guatemala or in El Salvador. And so the level of violence has now been replaced in some ways, not as political violence, but as gang-related violence. And people are afraid. We've had good conversations, whether it's on my own trips to the region or through our embassies, with the community groups that are working with families who are facing the notion of the gangs coming by to scoop up their children, and not just for prostitution, not just for human trafficking in the ways that many people think of, but even for forced criminal activity, which is a form of trafficking under the international law. And so this is, I think, something that we've recognized that we need to deal with, is, the idea of, these factors that are driving and impelling the destabilization, driving the fear that we see in some of these towns. It very much comes back to the notion of rule of law. And I think that what you're seeing from us is not just anti-trafficking projects in Central America, but general rule of law projects through the INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, being able to come in and start funding policing projects that look to community policing, that look to the ability of police to investigate a case, to ask questions, not to simply stand back, as is the practice in Latin America, and wait for what's called a denuncia, basically a denunciation, the victim coming in and actually saying, I am a trafficking victim and that's the person who trafficked me. We've found around the world that if you wait for that, you're never going to have any trafficking cases. And so working with the Central American governments over the last few years, we're starting to turn the needle on that a little bit so that there's more proactive work that protects those vulnerable communities. And then with the other hand, with our public assistance funding, we're actually able to go in with groups like Casa Alianza and others who are serving those at-risk street children, that are serving trafficking victims who are coming out of prostitution or other horrible offenses. And so we're trying to make sure that we can address the root causes on the one hand, address the criminal justice response on the other hand, and then we'll have a third hand, help the victims through these NGOs.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Mr. Lowenthal.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for holding the hearing. And I'm really pleased to be here and to learn more about not only the whole issue of human trafficking, but especially around forced labor and labor trafficking. And I thank you for that very complete kind of overview and report. I have a couple of questions that I want to know. On the report, you mentioned, when we talk about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 countries, and Tier 2, especially those that really do not comply with minimum standards, making some efforts to change. I wonder, and especially those countries that have a great deal of gang activity and forcing children and young people to engage in that. Do we have any understanding? Right now we have, there are a lot of Central American young children crossing our borders from both Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, all three of those countries being on Tier 2. Do we have any understanding of how many of these children are escaping, or families that wish them to escape from forced labor kinds of things, or engaging in activities that the families find extremely dangerous, that these children are really leaving because of that? And are we pursuing that and trying to understand that relationship?
One of the things that's allowed us to, I think, do that much more over the last few years is the Trafficking Act of 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And what it sought to do was to enshrine this notion of the best interest determination. We look at the best interest of the child. Say, for instance, if a Child Protective Services intervention here in the Washington, D.C. or in the suburbs, regardless of where the child's from, the first thing that you're supposed to ask is, what's in the best interest of this child?
Mm-hmm.
And that really was the genesis of the Section 4 of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization in 2008, which was, let's make sure that we're looking at this not simply through a security lens, but also through the humanitarian lens, through this lens of the best interest determination. And so it provides for time in which to do exactly that. So the screening that's done, whether it's by Customs and Border Protection agents or whether it's done over time by the folks from Health and Human Services, this is, I think, an important safeguard so that we make sure that there's that ability to do that screening. I can't tell you exactly what the results of those are. That's not something that we do. But I think that one of the things we've seen, and we've heard certainly the anecdotal reports of parents who are sending their kids north or grandparents who are sending the children north to be with their families because of the gang violence, because of the trafficking. And simultaneously, we've seen the reporting from our diplomats each year as to what's happening. Now, the fact that it's a tier 2 is looking at what are the government structures and what have the government done, as opposed to how bad is the problem of trafficking in that country. How bad the problem is not what puts you on the tier, it's what the government's trying to do. And over the last few years, we've seen good things from each of those governments that enabled them to come off of tier 2 watch list, whether it's new laws, whether it was new task forces, whether it was bringing together the different ministries, et cetera. Tier 2 is a very large tier. It's kind of the bell curve.
Right.
It is the bell of the bell curve. And there are tier 2 countries that are almost tier 3 countries. And there are tier 2 countries that are almost tier 1 countries. I think that in all 3 of these countries, we feel like there's a long way to go to be able to say that trafficking victims are protected in their hometowns.
If someone is seen either adjudicated through an immigration court or by at a border by Customs or Homeland Security or Health and Human Services to be a victim of human trafficking, are those potential grounds for asylum in the United States?
Well, one often wouldn't even get to the asylum analysis if there's a conclusion that the person is a victim of trafficking, because then they can go into the trafficking victims service response, which is in some ways it's not more generous than the asylum response, because what we did with the 2000 law was to open up the asylum response to trafficking victims. But it ends up moving them into a situation where the immigration decisions are not in an adversarial process. The asylum and refugee claims are still an adversarial process. The human trafficking claims are an application to Citizenship and Immigration Services, where the people who are experts in both human trafficking and in the cases of battered immigrant spouses. So it's that unit that handles these, that's very knowledgeable about issues of power, Stockholm Syndrome, dependency, vulnerability. Those are the adjudicators at the Immigration Service that would look at the petitions for the immigrant status for trafficking victims. And so while some have at times looked at the asylum and said, well, we need to have trafficking as a grounds for asylum, when I look at it, I look at countries around the world that have tried to route all of the trafficking victims through the asylum process, and it inadvertently puts them in an oppositional nature against the government, who's having to question whether they are asylees in the first place. So I think that what we see is if there's a way to look at these situations, say this is actually a trafficking victim, then hopefully they go through continued presence, they go through the T visa, they get certified by HHS. HHS has its provisions for unaccompanied alien children, which is the placements and everything else. If the person is truly unaccompanied, has no family, even foster care situations. A number of trafficking victims have been able to take advantage of those placements, et cetera, over the last years. So on the one hand, there is the asylum fears that need to be looked at, but there's also if there's a human trafficking fear.
Well, thank you. The other question, if I may continue, we are now going to be potentially fast-tracking a number of trade agreements, and one of them being the TPP. And I know that recommendations have been made regarding the TPP, that those that are, for example, others that are on the list here too, Vietnam, one, Japan, that we make sure that we ensure that there are labor standards in the TPP. But even before that, would you recommend that the Congress look at ensure that countries make improvements before we even allow them to go forward? Here we're going to move forward with trade agreements which potentially could benefit both countries. I'm in support of the concept, but I also have real concerns about rewarding bad behavior. Can you comment on that?
I certainly can. My office, of course, is not the office that works on the trade issues, and I'd certainly defer not only to the USTR, but also the folks in what we call our E family that reports to the Undersecretary for Economics. But this notion of labor protections and labor rights in part of the negotiations and as part of the agreements is a very important one. And I know that there was a meeting just a few weeks ago in Canada as part of the negotiations. I have to admit I was on the road and I haven't been briefed as to how those negotiations went. It's something we can probably circle back with you on. But I think that, you know, one of the things that we know is that the countries of the Pacific Rim, again, none of them do not have a slavery problem. Whether it's your tier 1 countries like Chile or the United States, whether it's tier 2 or even your tier 3 countries like Malaysia, we're all talking about countries that have to look at this. And I think that not only having it with the labor protections that are already being negotiated and that are to be built in, but then also making sure that the enforcement side ends up coming into play. One of the things that I continually hear from the customs guys is that the 1930s Tariff Act and its prohibitions of importation of slave-made goods has not caught up to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so they sometimes are wondering, how can we keep the shipping containers from coming into the United States? It goes back, I think, to the chairwoman's point about enforcement. It's not just about having these things on paper, it's making it so that they can be enforceable. And so I think that that's one of the things is tracking, talking with our TPP and other free trade partners, making sure that these discussions are being had as far as labor standards, but then also making sure that on the back end that our guys on the front line, especially at Customs and Border Protection, have a way to deal with these things when somebody's trying to bring them into the U.S.
Finally, my third question is, yes.
Excuse me, Representative Lowenthal, can I ask you to submit that for the record? Because we have another panel.
Oh, we do.
And
I'm sorry.
yes, we do have another panel, and the ambassador have provided us with a lot of very thorough information, but we'd also like to hear from the next panel. So thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Really appreciate what you've brought to the discussion and your expertise.
Thank you, Madam
And
Chair.
as we're preparing for the second panel, in the interest of time, each of our panelists this morning has a very lengthy bio. Because of all the work that they've been doing. And as we are transitioning, I'm going to start by giving just a portion of those lengthy bios so you know who is going to be on this next panel. We're going to hear from Neha Misra. Neha is the Senior Specialist for Migration and Human Trafficking at the Solidarity Center, which is an international organization that promotes workers' rights. She spent some time at the United States Department of Justice, as did the ambassador. We're also going to be hearing from Dan Viederman. He's the CEO of Veriti, I'm probably going to mispronounce that, that helps NGOs, governments, investors, and multinational companies improve working conditions and eliminate human rights violations. We're going to hear from Mr. Jesse Eves, the Senior Policy Advisor for Child Protection at World Vision, an advocacy organization that assists survivors of human trafficking. And finally, we're going to be hearing from Mr. Biram Da Abaid. He's the founder and president of the Initiative for the Resurgence of the Abolitionist Movement in Mauritania. Mr. Da Abaid's work to combat slavery has helped free hundreds of modern slaves. And again, we're going to ask that any written testimony will be included in the record. We'll also be submitting your oral testimony. And we appreciate your very much your being here and look forward to your testimony. And I know that there are different time frames been given to you, but I just want to emphasize that if you can keep your remarks concise, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. But let's start with Ms. Misra.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman.
Can you please push your microphone button? Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to say thank you, Chairwoman Bonamici and Representative Lowenthal, for inviting the Solidarity Center today to testify at this hearing. And in particular, I'd like to say thank you to Sarah and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for putting this together. Building upon more than 20 years of experience in the areas of child labor, migrant worker exploitation, and supply chain accountability, my organization, the Solidarity Center, raises awareness about the prevalent and underlying causes of forced labor and other forms of trafficking for labor exploitation, and implements programs with partners from myriad sectors to combat the problem. Our anti-trafficking programs span the globe, and while each country we work in has its own unique circumstances and problems, we have found a common theme. Human trafficking and forced labor have at their core violations of worker rights and lack of labor standards and protections for workers. Understanding this link between worker rights violations and human trafficking is key to eradicating this horrific human rights abuse globally. This means that to eradicate forced labor, we must address the underlying vulnerability of workers to exploitation, expand and enforce labor laws, and allow workers to organize to monitor their workplaces and improve their wages and working conditions. In other words, end worker exploitation to end human trafficking. While governments used to be the primary perpetrators of forced labor, the International Labor Organization now estimates that among the 21 million people in forced labor globally, the vast majority are exploited in the private economy. Trafficking for forced labor thrives in a context of private actors and economic coercion. Our response, therefore, must address this context, recognizing human trafficking as more than just sexual exploitation and more than just organized crime. We must exert economic pressure as a response and recognize the protection of worker rights as key to trafficking prevention. We also must reject policies and practices that restructure and institutionalize harmful economic and business models that increase worker vulnerability to human trafficking. I'd like to give you two examples today to explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to pick on two countries that were Tier 3 in the TIP report, Malaysia and Thailand. And Representative Lowenthal, you already raised one of the issues that I wanted to bring up regarding the trade agreements, the TPP in particular. Malaysia this year in the TIP report was downgraded to Tier 3, and we think justifiably. While the Malaysian economy thrives on cheap migrant labor, foreign workers in sectors such as agriculture, construction, service, manufacturing, and domestic work often have their rights violated with little recourse under Malaysian laws, policies, and practices. The Malaysian government has actually implemented policies recently that are increasing migrant workers' vulnerability to forced labor rather than decreasing. For example, a Malaysian government policy implemented in January 2013 places the burden of paying immigration and employment authorization fees on foreign workers rather than on employers, increasing the risk of debt bondage. And as you indicated, Representative Lowenthal, the U.S. is currently negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement with Malaysia, despite their disregard of worker rights in their Tier 3 ranking. We think it's absolutely crucial for Congress and the USTR to ensure that bilateral and multilateral trade agreements like the TPP, contain labor standards and protections to prevent trafficking, ensuring that standards apply to all workers, including migrants. And as you indicated, Congressman, we think that labor standards and trade agreements should include the same enforcement and dispute resolution mechanisms as other provisions such as intellectual property rights and not be relegated to side agreements, for example. Given our globalized economy, the link between worker exploitation and human trafficking in the context of forced labor perpetrated by private actors through economic coercion means that products made with forced labor are ending up on our grocery and retail shelves. And governments and businesses are not doing enough to ensure that supply chains are not tainted with forced labor and other forms of human trafficking. Again, I'll give an example of a Tier 3 country, Thailand. In 2008, the Solidarity Center released a report entitled The True Cost of Shrimp. Thailand is one of the main exporters of shrimp to the United States. The report highlighted how companies in Thailand systematically use the lack of labor rights and weak labor law enforcement to exploit the mostly Burmese shrimp processing workers. The report uncovered human rights abuses in the industry, such as unpaid wages, unsafe and unhealthy workplaces, child labor, forced labor, physical intimidation, violence, and sexual abuse. 6 years after the report, little progress has been made to clean up the industry. Reports continue to surface about human trafficking of migrant workers in the seafood processing sector in Thailand. Just this year, the Guardian newspaper conducted a 6-month investigation and found that a large number of migrant workers were bought and sold like slaves and held against their will on Thai fishing boats. The Guardian found that such forced labor plays an integral part in the production of shrimp sold in leading supermarkets around the world, including in the United States in stores such as Walmart and Costco. U.S. multinational corporations may be complicit in this. As I said earlier, Thailand is one of the largest exporters of shrimp to the United States. And as buyers of Thai processed seafood, these companies have not done enough to prove to consumers that their supply chains are not tainted with forced labor. When our report came out in 2008, Senator Harkin asked the Department of Homeland Security to do an investigation. ICE investigators admitted to us that they knew their investigation would not find forced labor in the industry in Thailand because they must notify the Thai government that they're coming to inspect, and the Thai government cleansed all the workplaces that they visited. As Ambassador Sedabaka pointed out, we have a law called the 1930 Tariff Act, but the law has a huge loophole in it called the consumptive demand exception. Because of the consumptive demand exception and because of the way that ICE conducts its investigations, not being allowed to use evidence from the media, NGOs, trade unions, et cetera, to enforce the Tariff Act has not been used to prevent products made with forced labor coming into the United States. Thailand is also part of the generalized system of preferences for trade status to the United States. The AFL-CIO filed a trade petition this year to ask the USTR to suspend Thailand from GSP preferences, and part of the reason that they gave were the forced labor in the seafood sector. Even in supply chains of products that are mostly for local use or consumption, like BRICS in South Asia, the model for addressing forced labor and other forms of human trafficking of workers must be holistic, address worker rights more generally, and use economic consequences and incentives. For example, all indications suggest that Pakistan's brick kiln sector is rife with bonded labor, and bonded labor is Pakistan's largest human trafficking problem. While hundreds of workers are freed from debt bondage each year through the efforts of NGOs, the practice goes largely unabated. Specifically, programs intended to improve the situation of brick kiln workers have been piecemeal at best, and none have tried to promote and link brick production to ethical procurement. The Solidarity Center has an office in Pakistan, which is currently implementing a project from the U.S. Department of State, where we are implementing a holistic approach with the concept of decent work brick kilns that meet a much higher standard than previously advocated by anyone. The project would bring on board government entities to support ethical procurement of bricks for construction. The government is a major purchaser of bricks, and if so motivated, it could help ensure that the program is self-sustaining, leveraging infrastructure development funds to ensure social justice through decent work wages and benefits for brick kiln workers. The Solidarity Center is promoting the concept of economic pressure, economic consequences, and economic incentives to combat bonded labor in the brick kiln industry in Pakistan. Through initiatives such as the upcoming FAR Council regulations to implement Executive Order 13627, strengthening protections against trafficking persons in federal contracts, and USAID's counter-trafficking in persons policy, the U.S. government is using federal procurement policy as a way to implement important anti-trafficking initiatives in government supply chains. The Solidarity Center and its partners are using similar economic models to urge governments to do the same, and private businesses must follow suit. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Viederman.
Thank you, and good morning, Congresswoman Bonamici and Congressman Lowenthal. Thanks so much, and thanks to the Commission as a whole for holding this hearing on an issue that we have worked on for a long time, as have others, and is maybe gradually receiving more attention from the private sector. That's the focus of our work, and it's the focus of my remarks. But at any rate, the trend seems to be moving in the right direction, so grateful for the chance to add momentum to that. Verity's work since the 1990s has been to illuminate human rights and labor rights violations in the global supply chains of multinationals, as well as their factories and farms from which they supply. For the most part, we work in confidence with our client companies. They give us access to their operations, and we tell them what we find and how to solve it. Beginning in the late 90s, around 1998, we began to see a strong correlation between the presence of foreign migrant workers in facilities, farms and factories, in places as diverse as Mauritius, Madagascar, Saipan, Jordan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and the presence of really serious human rights and labor rights abuses, including health and safety violations, restrictions on movement, sexual abuse and harassment, wage underpayment, excessive work hours, and other violations not only of international conventions, of national labor laws, but also violations of the company codes of conduct themselves, their voluntary commitments. Further investigation from funders, including Humanity United and others, led us to quantify the cause of this correlation. Essentially, high levels of debt incurred by migrants paid as fees to third-party intermediaries like labor brokers. Having borrowed thousands of dollars to pay these labor brokers at often very high rates of interest, securing these loans with what few assets they have, workers cannot risk losing their jobs. A story from a recent investigation in Taiwan illustrates this problem. At a Taipei shelter recently for vulnerable migrant workers, we met a college-trained Filipina named Eds. She was working cleaning toilets at a factory, despite having been promised a $600 a month job at a cell phone plant. Essentially, $600 a month is more or less Taiwanese minimum wage. How Eds got to this plant and ended up in a job quite different from what she had expected, and why she couldn't leave, is the story of forced labor in the global economy, one that is repeated millions of times in numerous other sectors and other countries. As we probably all know, in the Philippines, traveling abroad for a job is big business and also a desirable career path, considering the lack of jobs at home. Eds told us she had a big family and she wanted to help out her sister and her mother financially. So she found someone who promised her a good job in Taiwan. She borrowed close to $3,500 from a moneylender to pay this labor broker. After she conducted paperwork, went on a few bus trips around the Philippines, got some visas, undertook a medical exam, she was flown to Taiwan. When she got there, she found out that the job paid $325 a month, not the $600 she had been promised, or about $1.15 an hour, well below the legal wage in Taiwan. From that income, she had to pay over half, $185 monthly, so over half of her income, just to service her debt. On top of that, she was charged $50 a month to share a room in a decrepit and dangerous house. Another $40 went to pay the fees for the Taiwanese labor broker, who took her passport and held it. This left her with just over about $50 to cover food, transport, and any other expenses she might have faced in Taiwan, a reasonably expensive country. She did not have any money to send home. Why didn't Eds leave this job? Why don't workers like her simply leave and find other work? The answer is at the heart of what makes these paid laborers modern-day slaves. Their debt acts as an instrument of control, binding workers to this facility and this employer. Leaving the job means they will have violated the terms of their visa and become illegal immigrants. And quite interestingly and paradoxically, it is those who went through the process of getting a legal visa who are often most unwilling to leave their jobs and become illegal immigrants, even if that were beneficial to them in the short term. If they become illegal immigrants, certainly in particular countries like Taiwan and Malaysia, they will be subject to detention and deportation. And in the vast majority of cases like hers, employers will keep passports and identity documents, and they will frequently charge workers hundreds of dollars to retrieve them in the form of deposits. So they literally cannot escape. If workers do leave, or if they lose their jobs because they asked for safer working conditions, fewer overtime hours, or otherwise advocated for themselves, they will have no way to pay back the loans that they took. So in Ed's case, she would have lost $3,500. In many cases, the people who helped facilitate the migration have connections to organized crime, so workers have to keep paying their debt or risk the safety of their families back home. All it takes is a simple phone call from someone in Taiwan to a gang member back home in the Philippines that Eds is not being cooperative and her family will be threatened. This is a common story. We met Rafiq, a farmer from Indonesia who sought work in palm plantations in Malaysia. He was offered originally a job paying the equivalent of $444 a month with the potential for overtime and promised a work visa on arrival. When he got to the site, his passport was taken away. He was presented with unreachable quotas and forced to live in squalid conditions. He and a group of other workers objected to their treatment. The labor contractor had them arrested. He spent 10 months in detention and went home at a total loss of about $2,500 to him. It is importantly not just businesses and supply chains that face these risks. Migrant workers build infrastructure projects, universities and museums in Abu Dhabi, Olympic and World Cup infrastructure in Russia and Qatar, and provide services at U.S. government facilities abroad. Any sector that employs migrants runs a serious risk of employing slaves. It is also vital that we highlight the connection between human trafficking and corruption risks, an issue that is of great concern and should be of greater concern to companies. Agents and brokers who facilitate migration pay bribes to an assortment of players in the foreign labor supply chain, including complicit employers and also government officials, from labor, immigration, border control, and law enforcement authorities in both source and destination countries. These kickbacks and bribes are funded by illegal and excessive fees charged to workers. Indeed, the connection between modern-day slavery and corruption is a risk not only to workers, but also for the companies that employ them. Fortunately, these problems can be solved, but they can't be solved by standard corporate social responsibility practices. Forced labor is a hidden problem. Employers don't want you to know about it, and sometimes themselves are not fully aware of how they are connected to the illegal and brutal practices of traffickers who are connected to the provision of labor. And of course, workers are afraid to speak up lest they lose their jobs and are forced home deeper in debt than when they arrived. For multinationals and their suppliers, the steps to resolution are clear. I should say the initial steps to resolution are clear. The first step is that companies have to identify where are migrants working in their supply chains. How did those migrants get there? What conditions do they face? What recruitment agents facilitated their migration in the home country and in the country of employment? How much debt do the workers carry with them? Who do they owe that debt to? Which government officials, if any, were bribed to facilitate migration? Do workers have access to their passports? Is there a credible mechanism by which they can alert someone that they're in need of protection? So the first step for companies to take is to identify where they face this problem and what the nature of the problem is. Companies need to set clear policies that prevent workers from paying fees to get a job and providing full access to passports so that workers can leave their employer. Corporate policy must restrict or eliminate the ability of any supplier in its supply chain to force a worker to pay a fee to get a job. Companies need to build understanding and capability among employers on how to meet these policies. They need to ensure that employers only recruit through labor brokers who can demonstrate the understanding and capability to treat workers fairly and lawfully, including accessing government-run direct hiring programs on a bilateral basis. And lastly, they should share information throughout industry sectors so that shared exposure to unethical recruiters can be acted on jointly, eliminating the market for unethical and exploitative recruitment. A couple of examples of where this is happening. Through concerted effort by Infocus over 4 years in partnership with our organization Verite, Apple has facilitated the reimbursement by third parties of over $16 million to workers who paid excessive fees to work at Apple suppliers in Asia. In addition, some of the largest retailers in the world have committed to piloting our framework for ethical recruitment among their agriculture suppliers in the US and overseas. Apparel companies have begun to conduct risk-based due diligence on Taiwanese and Philippines-based brokers. In doing so, these companies are taking important first steps, and sometimes second and third steps, to eliminate the risks faced by workers, to support better human resources practices among their business partners, and to eliminate a host of illegal and unethical middlemen, the recruiters, from their operations. These businesses do not benefit financially from the presence of these recruiters. They actually carry all the risk without necessarily facing a lower price from their suppliers. An emerging regulatory regime strengthens the pressure on companies to take action. The California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the executive order that Neha just mentioned a second ago, and the mooted Federal Transparency in Supply Chains Act all seem to be compelling corporate action in a way that we find quite powerful. From our perspective, this is a problem that is severe and widespread. The solutions are at hand, and what we need is more companies to begin to take effort to take the first step to find out where these problems exist in their supply chain. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for your testimony. Now we'll move to Mr. Eves.
All right, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Congressman Lowenthal, for being here. It's a pleasure to be before this commission. As others have said, this commission has been at the forefront of this issue for a very long time, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. World Vision is an international relief, development, and advocacy organization that is focused on working with children and their families around the world. We're in about 100 countries. We've got about 45,000 employees that are really focused on working with families, their children, and their communities to address the root causes of poverty and injustice, and that includes forced labor and human trafficking. We've been asked to testify today about our global experience in preventing and responding to forced labor and human trafficking with a particular focus. We'll focus on two different areas. One is in East Asia and another in a couple of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, just to show the diverse nature that forced labor can take. These two regions in particular are a vital and increasingly influential component of the global economy. Yet, as you know, large areas of both East Asia and sub-Saharan Africa are home to large pockets of the poorest and most vulnerable people on Earth. And in both areas, the nature of the global marketplace is producing many opportunities to make money in a few nations, but is also creating more ways to exploit a person for their labor. So the opportunity is now, and tools are definitely available to make U.S. engagement and funding more coordinated, effective, and efficient in tackling this vulnerability. So together with our partners around the world, we can ensure that global economic growth is built on the strengths of a nation's people and not on their backs through bondage. So as in other countries, including America, forced labor takes on many forms, and we see children exploited in the textile industry, in agriculture, in construction, in the fishing industry, and forced to be domestic servants. And as my colleagues have already mentioned, it's nearly impossible to address the issue of forced labor and human trafficking without talking about migration. My written testimony contains the full account of Min Min, a Burmese boy who was sold to an Indonesian fishing boat and spent 9 years as a slave at sea. Cases like these have led World Vision to spend a great deal of effort educating communities, and especially children that are aged 13 through 17. These are children that are most likely to take a job away from home. We educate them on the dangers of risky migration and the proactive steps that they can take to prevent themselves from becoming victims. So for instance, in Southeast Asia, we provide a pocket guide in local languages called the Smart Navigator booklet. So this small, easy to understand booklet covers what human trafficking is. It provides a checklist for ensuring safe travel and even includes basic instructions on how to make an international phone call. So these simple yet effective steps have come from seeing so many stories like Min Min when migrating to earn money goes wrong. Our written testimony also focuses on the story of a 13-year-old Ethiopian boy named Walde. Unlike Min Min, Walde never left his country and yet was exploited for his labor all the same. Both Min Min and Walde were trafficked for their labor to contribute to a supply chain. And Min Min contributed to an international supply chain, while the cotton shawls that Walde made were destined for local markets. However, the goal and the end result were the same, that free, exploitable labor makes inexpensive products for the marketplace. So labor trafficking taints domestic and international supply chains and threatens companies, consumers, and entire economies even. Goods and services produced through exploitation pose a high reputational and financial risk to companies and their investors. Therefore, it's critical for companies to know what goes into the products they make, and even more critical for consumers to know what goes into the products that they buy. So it's highly unlikely that a consumer knew that the fish they were eating or the shawl they were wearing were a product of the forced labor of Min Min and Walde. And yet it's consumers who hold the big piece of the solution to ending forced labor in supply chains. So business transparency, as already mentioned, protects workers, companies, and consumers. It creates a level playing field so that consumers who want to purchase products untainted by forced labor or exploited labor can reward companies that are making efforts to root out exploitation in their supply chain. So obviously Congress can play a role in creating more transparency by passing H.R. 4842, that's the Business Supply Chain Transparency on Trafficking and Slavery Act of 2014. That's a mouthful. But it's critical to point out that governments cannot make this progress alone. And business transparency legislation will not be a silver bullet. And there's no single intervention or effort that can defeat the use of forced labor and human trafficking in the long term. And Congresswoman, you pointed this in your opening remarks, that it takes a multifaceted, multi-sector approach to combat exploitation, and World Vision firmly believes that. For example, in a project in Ethiopia funded by the U.S. Department of Labor, we reach over 20,000 children working in the textile industry and also in agriculture, domestic servitude, and other sectors. The program focuses on protection of these children, education, increasing household income, increasing access to credit, and the empowerment of local communities. We also focus on another key factor that most people take for granted, and that's birth registration. Human traffickers pursue individuals who are vulnerable and powerless, and without a birth certificate, children in particular are invisible to their governments and thus very easy to target and very easy to hide. The U.S. House has introduced the Girls Count Act, H.R. 3398, to empower the U.S. government to address the importance of birth registration. And we definitely thank the co-sponsors of that bill, including you, Congressman, for supporting that and taking on this important issue that, while it may not seem like it is related, is the first line of protection for many of these children, and as they get older, as for adult workers. The U.S. government currently has multiple options for partnering with governments that wish to really take on the issue of forced labor and human trafficking. So in addition to the diplomatic tool of the Trafficking in Persons Report, the U.S. government has tools to build on the recommendations of the TIP report with strategic, multi-sector, bilateral partnerships with focus countries. I'll refer you to my written testimony for a full list of these tools, which includes USAID's Counter-Trafficking in Persons Policy, the Action Plan for Children in Diversity, and the key provisions of the Child Protection Compact Act, which were included in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2013. So these tools allow for constructive and coordinated bilateral partnerships that will enable countries to develop and expand their systems of prevention, protection, and prosecution, and ideally address many of the root causes of trafficking. So Congress has given the administration good tools, and it's critical that we work together so that these tools are not left to rust in the toolbox. So thank you again for holding this hearing and for all the work you all continue to do in addressing forced labor and human trafficking. And we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And finally, we turn to Mr. Biram Da Abaid. And please correct me if I mispronounced your name. Welcome. Glad you're here.
Merci Madame pour éviter la lourdeur de la traduction du français en anglais. Je proposerai que ma collègue Meite lise directement ma communication en anglais.
So he thanks you for being here, and he says to avoid a very long testimony in English and French. He recommends that I read it for him.
That's fine. That's right. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Commission, I'm honored to have been invited by your prestigious Commission to speak on the theme of modern-day slavery and what we buy, a subject which is particularly dear to me. The session coincides with a crucial moment in the future of my country, in a context of economic crisis and an active denial of the practice of slavery and discrimination. Please thus allow me to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this wonderful opportunity which you have offered me in order to inform you of the daily suffering of slaves and marginalized people in Mauritania. The Mauritanian population, composed of Bambaras, Wolofs, Pulars, Soninkés, Arabo-Berbers, and Haratins, currently live in a society characterized by profound disparity and ancient practices sustained by a system of discriminatory governance and exclusion. The Haratins, the main victims of slavery, constitute nearly 50% of the Mauritanian population. Broadly, this population is poor, uneducated, and lives in peripheral communities of Mauritania's main cities and in rural zones. Both the descendants of slaves and slaves are abused without mercy and are excluded from the institutionalized economic system. Approximately 50% of Haratins live in conditions of slavery and are submitted to domestic servitude, forced labor, or bonded labor. They remain marginalized and underrepresented in political posts and in public service. The Haratin make up 80% of the illiterate population, with 80% of Haratin not having completed elementary school and representing only 5% of students at institutions of higher education. More than 90% of the dock workers, domestic workers, and workers of low-skilled and low-paying jobs are Haratin, whereas only 2% of high-level officials and senior public and private sector leaders derive from this group. Full power, as well as the economic benefits, are controlled by the Arabo-Berber community. Foremost, I would like to point out the duplicity which the Mauritanian state and the dominant groups use to scoff at international opinion and make light of the country's partners. Indeed, modern anti-slavery and anti-discrimination laws are decreed. A roadmap deliberately omitting the existence of the scourge of slavery has been compiled. The country adheres to the principal international instruments for defending human dignity, but, at the same time, the state continues to protect and extend all the privileges solely to the Arabo-Berber community. The state divides Muslims into masters and slaves, and stipulates that the slave is his master's property, and that his master can sell him, give him away, use him as security, give him as a gift. The master thus enjoys the labor of his slave without paying him wages, and he has access to the bodies of female slaves against their will, no matter how old they are or how many they are. A master can thus use and abuse his female slaves as he pleases. This description, not complete, of what is called the Black Code in Mauritania is still in effect and is taught in numerous law schools and divinity schools. It finds itself codified in the books which my organization symbolically burned on April 27, 2012 in Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania. IRA Mauritanie, IRA Mauritania, and SOS Slaves, one of the principal and officially recognized anti-slavery organizations in Mauritania, continually work to draw the attention of the authorities on the gross abuses endured by the slaves, but the responses thus far have been far from what we expect. In 2013, Mauritania put in place a governmental solidarity agency called Tadamoun. This agency is meant to support victims of slavery, but it has been voided of all substance. Today, the agency is a political propaganda tool, completely guided and controlled by those close to masters and stakeholders in the system of slavery. The actions undertaken by this agency are not for the benefit of the real victims. In reality, all the victims of slavery identified in the regions of Hods, Trarza, Asaba, Brakna, Adrar, and Nouakchott have never benefited from any assistance from this agency. In these regions, women who have escaped slavery and moved to large urban areas do not receive governmental assistance. These women are very poor, uneducated, often divorced or never married, but have children born from repeated rape by their former masters. The programs initiated by this agency are very often put in the hands of Arabo-Berber businessmen who are close to power and who continue to enrich themselves, much to the discontentment of the Haratin masses, poor and bound in servitude, who are the very people these programs are supposed to help. The true defenders of the rights of slaves are not asked to be part of the conception, management, or implementation of the policies of the Anti-Slavery Commission. In 2013, my country announced the creation of a special court to deal exclusively with slavery and slavery-related crimes, but until today, not one measure has been taken to clarify its composition, where it stands in the legal framework, its prerogatives, and guarantees of its independence. Since the enactment of the law criminalizing slavery in 2007, none of the cases brought before the judiciary have been dealt with appropriately. Take the case of two brothers, Said and Yarge, in 2011, for which only one sentence was handed down. Today, the case is with the Criminal Division of the Nouakchott Court of Appeals due to the liberation of the only convicted person after only 3 months of detention and then a subsequent annulment of his sentence. In Mauritania, household servants constitute an extremely exploited marginal population that enjoys no legal protection. In 2011, the country enacted a decree regulating domestic labor, but it was not applied and it went unheeded. Cases of human trafficking toward the Gulf countries have been pointed out several times to the state of Mauritania without the state ever taking appropriate protective measures. The victims of trafficking are generally exploited as household servants or as sex workers. the Mauritanian state has established a patronage system skewed in favor of Arab Berbers in all sectors of the national economy: mining, fishing, manufacturing, and more. The system allocates exclusively to Arab Berbers the benefits required for activity in these economic sectors. They thus are able to amass heaping profits, which allows the domination and exploitation of slaves to continue. Descendants of slaves and Afro-Mauritanians are exploited in these economic sectors and paid meager salaries. I'd like to add that in addition to the practice of hereditary slavery, the Mauritanian state also fosters a system that excludes and discriminates against the Afro-Mauritanian community. People responsible in Mauritania for the crime of slavery are protected by the Mauritanian state and enjoy immunity. More than 30 cases of slavery, mostly affecting women and children, are pending before national courts without any convictions handed down. Taking advantage of the fear and ignorance of slaves, Mauritanian courts always use the ruse of paying very small sums of money to victims, disguising this as reparations for being enslaved. Victims of slavery and injustice in my country need you to convince Mauritania's government to end this political, economic, and diplomatic policies of impoverishing and denying justice to vulnerable populations by recognizing the existence of massive-scale slavery to which the Haratines are subjected. In conclusion, they need you to convince Mauritania to cease its hypocrisy and apply its national laws as well as the international laws that Mauritania has fully adopted. We need you to help us abolish the teaching of the valorization of slavery and other forms of inequality that are part of our books and age-old codes, and that only our country still grants immunity to today. To conclude, I'd like to pay tribute to all the militants, women, and men of IRA, SOS slaves, and to all my friends and my family for their sacrifices and loyalty to the cause we defend. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very compelling testimony. I'm going to ask a question to each of you, and I'll start with the last witness, Mr. Abaid. Thank you very much for that testimony. It was very compelling, and obviously your country has just recently abolished slavery and criminalized slavery only in 2007. But obviously, based on your testimony, there's still a lot of work to do. The commission is formed, nothing has happened, prosecutions are not moving forward. So what role can the United States and the international community, what role can we play to support your efforts? Is your legal infrastructure in place to ensure that your country can effectively combat slavery if there is prosecution and enforcement? So what can we do?
Très bien. Lui il y a tout encore à faire parce que le gouvernement n'a encore rien fait comme avancé sur le terrain.
He said there's everything left to do because the government has yet not done anything actually on the ground.
Parce que notre organisation anti-esclavagiste, elle est interdite.
My anti-slavery organization is not legally allowed in Mauritania.
Les militants contre l'esclavage sont en prison.
The people the militants who are fighting against slavery, they're in prison.
Ils sont empêchés de travailler dans le pays.
They're prohibited from working. They're stopped from working in the country.
Ils sont même débauchés de leurs fonctions. On ne peut pas travailler et gagner sa vie quand nous sommes engagés contre l'esclavage en Mauritanie.
They cannot even earn a living because you cannot work for against slavery and also earn your life.
Bon, il y a les instruments internationaux que la Mauritanie a ratifiés.
So Mauritania has clearly ratified many international instruments
contre le trafic, contre l'esclavage,
against trafficking in persons, against slavery,
contre la discrimination,
against discrimination,
contre la traite des humains.
against trafficking in people and selling people.
Donc il faut attaquer la Mauritanie qui continue à violer les conventions qu'elle a ratifiées sur le plan international.
So the U.S. really needs to point to Mauritania and call them out on not complying with the international treaties that it has.
Je pense que
become
les
party
États-Unis
to.
peuvent jouer un rôle important.
And he thinks that the United States can really play a very important role in this.
Parce que c'est un partenaire premier de la Mauritanie, les États-Unis.
Because the U.S. is a is a very, very close partner of Mauritania, the number one partner.
Voilà. Il y a les gens qui sont... Il y a des dossiers fabriqués pour nous qui sont passibles de la peine de mort. Moi et 7 de mes amis, nous avons un dossier en Mauritanie, dans les tribunaux. On peut à tout moment être jugé et condamné à la peine de mort. Nous sommes en liberté provisoire.
Right now, I'm here because I'm in provisional liberty. Me and 7 of my friends and I actually have cases pending against us in Mauritanian courts, which can be handed down at any moment. So, being here is even a provisional liberty due to my fight against slavery.
Bon, un point important, toutes les lois que la Mauritanie édicte contre l'esclavage et toutes les conventions qu'elle ratifie, c'est pour la consommation extérieure, mais ce n'est pas pour l'application. Jamais un esclavagiste un criminel d'esclavage n'a été réprimé par les lois en Mauritanie.
So, international treaties and conventions against slavery that Mauritania has ratified is only for external consumption. Mm-hmm. It's not for implementation on the ground. And there's not been a single case of a slave owner being actually prosecuted and put in jail.
Well, thank you very much. I know it takes a lot of courage to do what you do in your country. We are fortunate to have you here sharing the importance of the work yet to be done, and we look forward to further conversations about what our country and the international community can do. So thank you again on behalf of the Commission. Mr. Eves, I wanted to ask you, you talked about what your organization does to educate. What happens when there is a victim of trafficking or forced labor? What about when they go back home? Say, for example, they are helped and assisted by either your organization or another NGO, or do they get any services? What happens when they get back home to their home country? Is there anyone helping them afterward?
We always want to make sure, that's an excellent question. We always want to make sure that whenever we see a child or an adult removed from forced labor, that they get the full range of services that they deserve. So that's not just the short-term provision of services immediately after they're removed, but we want to make sure that they make it all the way back to a community, either their home community or any community where they will feel safe and can resume a normal life again. So in the case of both Min and Walde, once they were removed from the forced labor, there was a period where they stayed with a service provider that we partner with. Well, in Walde's case, he stayed directly with World Vision. In Min's case, he worked with a partner. And then we helped trace back where they came from, and then worked because with Min's case, he was going from Indonesia back to Burma. We worked with the International Organization of Migration to make sure that he made it safely back to Burma, and then our staff on the ground in Burma worked with him to get him back to his home community. They let his community and his parents in particular know that he was alive, and then worked with them. There's obviously a long healing process that takes place. When you've been gone for 9 years and you've been subjected to the kind of trauma that these children and adults are subjected to, you don't just assert yourself back into normal life overnight. And so there's intense efforts made to make sure that both the survivor and their family are getting to a point where they're comfortable and they can start living their lives normally again. And so a lot of work is done to make sure that, particularly for the survivors community, that they'll be welcomed back, that they will, there will be an opportunity for them either in education or some sort of employment, so that they never have to try to leave to find a job again that could wind up in exploitation.
Thank you. I just want to point out that there are certainly challenges when someone's been away for so long, and with sex trafficking, it's really difficult as well, and completely different set of issues sometimes. But I know that when we've had conversations here in this country about sex trafficking, how the services are provided to the victims so that they do not feel as if they are criminals, and some people want to incarcerate them until they can get services, and others feel that that's counterproductive. But we have to make sure that we have the services in place for those who have been trafficked for labor as well as sex trafficking. Mr. Viederman, I wanted to follow up on your work that you've done, because I was really interested in how you said that you work with client companies, and that's typically, I think that's your approach. It's really, really, really interesting. You talked about the framework for ethical recruitment. I wanted to talk about whether the companies that you're working with do more to promote their work, and I know the legislation that's pending may address that somewhat, but do they identify their companies as companies that have taken extra steps to assure that they're following laws and labor standards? Do they have a competitive advantage if they do that? Is there some effort to promote the work, because you said it's typically confidential work? How can we build on it, encourage more companies to take that approach of assuring that their products are free from, in the supply chain, from forced labor?
And thank you. It's a wonderful question. I'll repeat that so everyone can hear me. I think it is essential that we bring companies out of the shadows on this issue. And that means helping them illuminate in the shadows of their own supply chain so they have a better understanding of what they're doing, but then also be willing to stand next to them and say, this is a good practice. There's a very small number of companies that are actually doing anything measurable to reduce the vulnerability of people in their supply chains, especially people who are as vulnerable as those who've been trafficked. But there are a handful, and yet they are still unwilling to stand up and broadcast what they're doing, because they're concerned that their consumers will not understand when they talk about forced labor, even if they talk about it in the context of doing something good, that they'll still be somewhat penalized from it. So I think anything that we can do, like this forum, like increased regulation, like opportunities to essentially force companies to start to disclose, during which process they will realize the world has not come to an end. They can still continue to sell their products, and indeed probably have benefited substantially by the elimination of unethical middlemen that are in many cases not even known to them. That will help, I think, drag companies out of the shadows on this set of issues. There are also, however, very few metrics available. So I mentioned one in my remarks, that Apple has facilitated the return of this substantial amount of money. I sure would love to see a way to highlight other companies doing the same sort of thing. As of yet, that is, for me, the best indication of a company addressing this issue in a quantitative way that is beneficial to the company and also measurably beneficial to the workers. So to highlight that somehow and bring that practice into the work of other companies would be a real step forward.
Right. Well, and certainly on the flip side, there are companies that I think with their practices have been highlighted, and certainly with increased use of social media, the consumers of the products, once they find out that there's an issue, for example, with the shrimp in Thailand, I think that the consumers can have a significant voice out there in the community in highlighting where they see that there are problems. But I'm trying to find a constructive way to highlight the companies that are stepping up. And some states actually have social responsibility corporations. My state of Oregon does, right? Your state of California likely does as well. So we may see this, hopefully, the companies stepping up and taking steps that they can. Ms. Misra, I wanted to talk a little bit about labor recruiters. Certainly, there's been an increasing role on the labor recruiters, but many of them may be small operations, particularly hard to monitor. So how can the United States help ensure that the recruiters are not charging fees for their services, which forcing workers into debt bondage for being dishonest about the work? We heard those stories. In what ways can U.S. companies monitor, again, to make sure that their workers are not being trafficked or victims of forced labor, with particular focus on those recruiters?
Thank you so much for the question, Representative.
Is your microphone on?
Yes, it's on. Thank you so much for the question, and you actually hit on something that I'm very passionate about. And actually, World Vision Verite and the Solidarity Center are all members of a coalition called the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, or ATEST. And we've been working on for several years on legislation to end fraud in our non-immigrant visa programs and prevent trafficking through greater regulation of foreign labor recruiters. And there's a bill right now pending in the House called H.R. 3344, which is designed to do exactly that. And to address your question, we think that the best way to be able to address the role that labor recruiters play in increasing the vulnerability in trafficking workers is to ensure, first and foremost, that they aren't allowed to charge fees. And we think that while it's difficult, as you mentioned, when labor recruiters have huge networks that go down to maybe just an individual agent in a village, it's very difficult to monitor that. We do think that starting with this legislation, H.R. 334, is a great step forward. And we hope it'll serve as a model for the rest of the world and for other countries to pass similar legislation, because you would be shocked, I think, to see how little regulation there is of labor recruiters around the world. And so by just having a policy that says you cannot charge fees, we think is the first step. The second step in that would be employers, the way that they can monitor this is one that they should be required to use a licensed or registered labor recruiter, and that's something that this bill is requiring. The bill provides a safe harbor for employers if they use a registered labor recruiter, but the bill also provides mechanisms for access to justice. So if it is violated and workers are charged a fee, they will now have ways through this bill, administrative, civil, and criminal remedies that they can use, and access to justice they can use to hold these labor recruiters accountable, and they will now know who they are. Part of the problem is a lot of workers in countries of origin don't even know who the labor recruiter is that the employer hired because of the agents and et cetera that they use below that. They're often not given full information about the type of visa that they're coming to the United States to work on, et cetera. And so we think that requiring full disclosure, requiring the elimination of fees, and registering labor recruiters is a great step forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lowenthal, and before I turn it over to Mr. Lowenthal, I just want to apologize in advance that I may need to leave before his questioning, but I wanted to thank all of you, each of our witnesses, for your expertise, for helping us on the commission highlight the importance of this issue, and for also giving us some good information about the concrete steps that we can take to help address international human trafficking and forced labor. So thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing your expertise. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you. I'm going to be brief also because I will have to leave really soon. I want to follow up, and I want to thank the panel for both your work and what you've done, and your educating me and others, and also the courage that you have displayed. I want to follow up on an issue that was raised by the chair, talking about what states have done. Now we're looking at federal legislation. My state, for example, has done the California Transparency in Supply Chains, which requires both the retail sellers and the manufacturers who make more than a certain amount of money, I believe it's $100 million, in doing business in California, to disclose their efforts to eradicate slavery and human trafficking from their direct supply chain. My issue is, as we move forward now at large, we know, and I've heard how difficult it is in the issue around enforcement, how effective. Now, I believe this bill is now 4 years. I was a supporter of the bill when I was in the state legislature. What do we learn from that, and that we can modify now as we move forward at a national? I know there are some companies that have done a very good job in trying to comply, and there are others that have not. I know that too. So what have we learned that can really help us as we move forward?
Thank you so much for that question, Representative Lowenthal. And before I address the transparency law, I just want to mention that California also has a bill pending right now on regulating foreign labor recruiters. And any support that you could give in speaking to the governor about signing that bill into law, once we get it passed, we would really appreciate that, because it's in a very crucial stage right now. So I get to put a little plug in for that.
Good plug.
And in terms of the California law on transparency, first of all, we were all again, the Alliance to End Slavery Trafficking that we're members of pushed really hard for that legislation, and we're very thankful to California of taking the lead in that so that we can use it as a model for the federal legislation. We have been encountering problems, and one of the things that Attest has been doing has been engaging with the state government to try to get them to release the information about which companies are complying and which companies are not complying, and that would be really helpful for us as advocates and as activists on this issue to be able to have that information. So again, anything you can do to help that process along would be greatly appreciated. And unfortunately, I'm going to turn it over to both Jesse and Dan because they can get a little bit more specific, but we haven't seen as many companies complying as we'd like to see and not providing as much specific information as we think would be useful. A lot of companies have actually just said, we're not doing anything, and that's the reporting that they put up there, or just providing very little information. But I'll turn it over to these guys for more specific.
Yeah, so what I would say is as we look forward, there are a couple of key opportunities coming up in which the U.S. can really assert its leadership role. So I think what we've learned is that there's a real need to create the incentive and foster basically the way business works. We want to make sure that companies are rewarded for trying to do the right thing. No company will be perfect, but I think that just making the effort and really, once you start taking those key steps, and I think Verity's research has really fleshed this out over the years, that is, when you start taking those steps and you start seeing what goes into your supply chain, you often find several areas, not even related to forced labor and exploitation, where you can actually save money. And so there's often a fear of spending too much out front and that it could cost companies extra. But there are, as we look at what the role the U.S. government plays, and Ambassador C. DeBaca mentioned, we are the U.S. government is the single largest purchaser in the world. And coming up later this year, the G20 will be meeting in Australia. And one of the issues on the table is about they're calling it a common approach to public procurement. Basically, the G20 countries all adopting a set of rules and regulations that anyone who wants to sell to them has to follow. So that, and companies like this, because they only now will have one set of rules to comply with as opposed to 20 or 100 or however it may be. And so that's a real key moment for the U.S. to show leadership, to show what we've done already with the executive orders, and to maybe push ourselves even further on the issues of, for instance, closing the consumptive demand loophole. But there are two opportunities. One, the labor ministers of the G20 countries are meeting in September in Australia. That's a chance. The U.S. Department of Labor has done a good job of highlighting best practices in addressing supply chain transparency. And then there's the actual G20 meeting in November, also in Australia, where, again, this issue will come up, and it's an opportunity for the U.S. to really exert its influence. And it's something that companies that we've talked to and have worked with are fond of, because they say, look, if we can only have to follow one set of rules and we're going to get rewarded by getting government procurement contracts, we're on board. And so those are two opportunities where we can really seize the moment.
Thank you. Add a couple of points. First of all, the focus on recruiters is the next step. The California Act, as it stands now, requires company to disclose. It seems to be acceptable so far to disclose that you're doing nothing or don't really care about the issue. That is a penalty that perhaps there's some legal cost to, but there should be more social cost and consumer cost. But that's a process that needs those of us in the activist world, the advocate world, to sort of take up. But refining either through the current California Act or as it's in its federal sibling, or through the recruitment-specific bill, to make sure that the focus is on the increased transparency and requirement of regulating recruiters. For the vast majority of multinationals at the highest, sort of their direct supplier level, it is recruitment-driven forced labor that they should be paying attention to. So anywhere there is a presence of third parties, recruiters, warehousing, cleaning crews, people who are being essentially given jobs in their general operations without them knowing where it is, that work is being facilitated by these recruiters. Those companies, it's going to be harder for them to figure out to what extent they're exposed to a raw material somewhere else. It ought to be very much placed on their table right in front of their CEOs daily priority list, that this is something they need to look at the top level. So focusing on recruiters, and then adding some cost, however that should emerge. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know to what extent that's possible, but to the extent that this law then gets taken the next step and becomes enforceable, so much the better.
I want to, I have some other questions, but I'm going to submit them in writing. I would like to know what is the bills that in California about recruitment, if you could just speak to my staff, so that we can help and kind of, do you know if that's with the governor now, or is it still in the legislature?
Still in the legislature, just passed through one of the committees, and I'm sorry, Jesse, do you remember?
It's okay, whatever it is, you don't have to
we have
just
lots
get
of
me
information.
all that information. I'm really hearing very clearly the point on recruitment now and recruiters. That's really the next step that we have to do, and maybe that's something that I can really help on with, and I'd like to do that.
Thank you so much.
And I'm not going to ask another question, but I am, as a psychologist, very much interested in mental health issues, and especially, and I'm going to ask you to maybe help me on that as we move forward also. But I want to thank the panelists for a wonderful presentation today, great education. I think this is exactly what the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission should be doing, having that forum, educating us, and thank you very much.